This is the 3T Exploro Limited, the world's first aero gravel bike, and I'm not sure if that makes sense either. This is the brainchild of Gerard Vroomen, who used to be the designer at Cervelo. You can probably tell by looking at this that it's got some of the design traits of a Cervelo. Witness this cabling arrangement, which is not my favourite thing about the bike. The Exploro is sort of like the bastard child of a really Euro cross-country racer and an actual road bike. It's got geometry like a road bike, but it's got huge tyre clearances, and it's designed to take either 650B or normal 700C size road tyres. The logic behind the tyre thing is that a 650B with a big fat tyre on it is very similar in size, in rolling diameter that is, to a road tyre. The aero gravel part is maybe the bit that needs most justification by 3T. When you think about gravel, you probably think about bike packing and people tending to go quite slowly on a variety of terrain. You don't think about racing. The actual aero claim for this bike is that compared to a similar frame without the aero features, it saves 7 watts at 20 miles an hour, or a slightly more useful 24 watts at 30 miles an hour, although obviously you'll be doing quite well to do 30 miles an hour on gravel. That aero goodness comes courtesy of the usual sort of thing, so you've got truncated aerofoil section down tube, truncated aerofoil section seat tube, seat post, nice aero blade section on the forks, and the cables are kind of tucked behind the stem there. This frame has a host of other quite quirky little features which are sort of little pet projects of Gerard Vroomen. For example, the seat clamp is completely hidden inside the frame here, and it's accessed by a hole you go up through with an Allen key, which is fine, but you'll be in a lot of trouble if you ever round that bolt off. In addition to that, there's a little hole in the frame there which is called Checkpoint Charlie, and that's so that you can check if your seat post is down far enough in the frame, because obviously it's quite important that you don't exceed the minimum insertion point. I haven't had a problem with the seat clamp, but you do need quite a long Allen key, and normal multi-tools actually won't reach in there. The rear derailleur hanger design on this bike is quite unique as well. When you take the rear through axle out and pop the wheel out, the whole hanger assembly with the derailleur attached also comes out. That's good for clearance, and it means that derailleur is self-locating when you put the axle in, but it does mean that you sort of need 3 hands when you're putting everything back together, which is quite annoying. The through axle at the front's not totally conventional either, in that the retaining nut on the end is not actually attached to anything, and it can actually drop out of the fork, which can be kind of annoying, especially as the wheel is not totally self-locating. This bike obviously has no suspension at all, but it does get some rear end comfort from an elastomer in the seat post here. The clamp assembly that holds the saddle rails is sort of suspended in a ring of squishy stuff, and that does provide quite a bit of squish when you're riding. As you can see, this bike has quite a distinctive asymmetrical chainstay arrangement. The drive side drop stay is simply for clearance. It means that you can get both the fat tyres in there, and you can also have your cranks in the usual position. You can't have both essentially without doing that. 3T sent us this very nice build. It's got SRAM Force 1x gearing with a very, very expensive THM clavicular carbon crank. The wheels are 3T's own Discus Plus C25 Pro, which is a really wide alloy rim which can be run tubeless. It's obviously well suited to this. It's also 650B, but as I say, you can run either of the 2 wheel sizes on this bike. Unsurprisingly, it's also got a 3T cockpit, including some very Gucci Ergonova Limited carbon bars. It's also got WTB Horizon 47mm tyres, as well as a WTB saddle. I'm not actually sure what the ideal tyre would be for this bike. The WTB slicks are brilliant on kind of general, quite dry riding, but on anything remotely muddy or slippery, they have absolutely no grip whatsoever. Also, it's possible that this build taxes things slightly to the limit on the crank front, because this very Gucci crank has bolts that protrude out the back, perhaps more than is strictly wise. and it looks like a tiny bit of dirt has got behind there, and it's actually scored quite a nice line in the chainstay there, which if it were my carbon frame would be very upsetting. The Exploro isn't sold as a complete bike normally. It's available as a frame set in the UK for £3,360 or $4,200 in the US. So with that in mind, how it rides is going to be quite important. Built like this, it's not a cheap bike. The design philosophy behind this bike is a little bit unusual. With mountain bikes, we're very used to the idea that riding off-road means everything gets longer, slacker, and more tolerant of kind of scary downhill stuff. The Exploro takes essentially completely the opposite approach and is very kind of, I guess you could call it Euro. It goes for super quick handling over inherent stability, and it does that by giving you a lower trail fork than you'd maybe expect. The logic behind that geometry is that it reduces the size of any steering inputs you need to give, meaning that if you are correcting your course because you're going down a rocky descent or something, then you don't need to move the bars as much. That is, in my opinion, not ideal for off-road riding. This is basically like a road bike. It's got not particularly wide drop bars on it. It's got quite a steep front end. And if I'm honest, on anything remotely technical, I, as somebody who's not very good at riding off-road, find it quite scary. Having said that, in its more natural element of actual gravel, stuff like what I'm standing on now, the Exploro is brilliant because being like a road bike, it is really, really good at smashing it along fairly smooth but not tarmac surfaces. Obviously, you could take a more cyclocross approach and fit actual knobbly tyres to this bike, but I quite like the giant fat slicks approach because it means that you get a bike that has a lot more grip on smooth surfaces than a road bike would, but it doesn't really feel much slower. Obviously there is going to be more rolling resistance than a 25mm road tyre, but you don't really notice that in normal riding. In other respects, the Exploro is like a road bike as well because it's very stiff. You get out the saddle and you crank it, and it is very much like a race bike. It has pretty much no give in it at either end, really. With tyres this big, there's obviously huge scope for tweaking comfort. You can, especially if you're running tubeless, you can go really, really low on pressures, but to be honest, you don't need to go that low. There is a bit of a mismatch, I think, in comfort between the front and rear ends coming from the frame, because the front end really doesn't have any built-in give at all, whereas the elastomer seat post gives quite a lot of squish to the rear end, and you can actually feel it flexing as you're riding over bumps. The front end is just like any rigid fork, and if you hit anything rocky on that, then you can really feel it. This bike's got a 38 tooth narrow wide chainring on the front and a 1042 cassette, and for general riding that's kind of all you need, I've found. Obviously the steps between gears are not tiny, but for kind of tooling around it's fine. I probably don't need to justify the choice of having disc brakes on a bike like this. It would frankly be mad not to. They work great, end of story. The big takeaway from riding the Exploro for me has been that it's quite a lot of fun. I'm still a bit on the fence about the whole aero gravel thing because personally I just don't really care that much about aero on a bike like this. I'm sure there are gravel racers who will, and obviously this would be a very compelling choice of bike for them, but for me it's just not really a factor in a bike like this. Also, the approach to geometry is a bit curious, I guess I'd say, but for a certain kind of riding, this bike works really well. I'm really glad that brands like 3T are making kind of wacky bikes like this because it is a bit different to everything else on the market. It's taken existing ideas and kind of combined them into one bike, but it's not a bike that I could easily recommend in a kind of rational buyer's guide sort of a way. For those of you who are dedicated gravel racers, this might well be the bike for you, but for the rest of us it's just a very expensive N+1.